So when we left off, we were talking about the war in Iraq, but now I want you to look at the Bush administration again, but we're going to look at different issues. I want you to start by looking at this chart. The question is, are you satisfied with how things are going in America? And as you can see, the gray line, the Democrats, are getting pretty dissatisfied pretty quickly. Not surprising. The party that's out of power often is more mad about what's going on, but look at what starts to happen around 2004. In 2004, 74% of Republicans are satisfied, but then look at what happens after that. It just falls off a cliff, and by the end of Bush's terms, at the end of Bush's term, we've got Republicans and Democrats and independents all being pretty dissatisfied with how things are going in America. Well, what's going on? One answer to that question is in 2005, there's something called Hurricane Katrina. Now, Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster, a bad hurricane that hit the Gulf Coast, and it hit New Orleans, which is this low-lying city that's always going to have a hard time with floods, and the rains were pretty bad. But in many ways, Katrina was a man-made disaster. Man-made in that the man-made levees that were supposed to contain the floodwater from getting into New Orleans failed, unleashing a torrent of water over the city. Eventually, 80% of it is flooded. But also man-made in that the government, Democrat and Republican, local, state, and federal level, really mishandled it, and as a result, around 1,500 people died. Man-made also in that a lot of people were just stuck in the city. Some ignored the evacuation order, but others just couldn't leave. They didn't have the cars, or there wasn't enough public transit, or they just didn't. Now, one key thing to understand about the public impact of Hurricane Katrina was that it was a media event. You saw that video with the coverage, and therefore you could see that there was video footage and photographs of people in these desperate situations that really shook the country. You've got these horrible images of people stuck on roofs as the waters rise. Nowhere to go. We see this here of a person having to drop their baby for someone just to that said, the thing that I remember the most from watching on TV was the Superdome. So the Superdome was this emergency spot for folks who couldn't get out of the city, and it got totally overwhelmed. There were so many people that there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough water, there weren't enough supplies. And of course, the people who are there are hungry and they're tired and increasingly desperate. It was a really difficult thing to watch. And then there was the convention center. Now, the convention center wasn't supposed to be an evacuation site, but the word must have gotten out that it was, and therefore hundreds of people show up anyway, but they don't have any food and water there for days. Now, one of the things about the storm is it brought existing race and class inequality into stark relief. If you look at who was stranded, it was disproportionately the poor, black residents and elderly residents of New Orleans, the people with the least ability to easily get up and go and leave New Orleans in advance of the storm. And certainly the images of the people suffering are largely black people. Thus, you get that famous and probably overly simplistic moment in which Kanye says George Bush doesn't care about black people that you saw in that clip. Now, I don't think that's entirely fair, but what is true is that black people were disproportionately affected because of existing racial disparities, and the government screwed it up. Right? There was some criticism of the Democratic governor, the Democratic mayor who waited too long to give the evacuation order, but in particular, the federal government, FEMA, came in for a lot of criticism. They were slow to act. It was something like 4 days after the storm, and they still hadn't brought food and water and other supplies. They were also just confused, unaware of what was going on. There were these moments where FEMA administrators are on TV being interviewed by CNN, and they don't know something. The FEMA people don't know something that the CNN anchor does, and that people have known, anyone who's been watching CNN would know, that just make them look particularly bad. Kind of adding to this in terms of people blaming Bush for this is that the person in charge of FEMA at this time was this guy named Michael Brown, and he's a loyal Republican and a big fundraiser, but he has no experience in emergency management. His previous job was being in charge of the International Arabian Horse Association, and as Brown came in for more and more criticism, there's this famous clip where Bush says, he's standing next to Brown, he says, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." And that clip of Bush saying, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," became sort of legendary among Bush's critics, an example of how out of touch Bush was, supposedly, about the situation in New Orleans. Now, I'm certainly not trying to say that everyone in America turned their back on Bush after Katrina. I think a lot of Republicans, blame the Democrats for the situation in New Orleans, blame the people in New Orleans for not evacuating quickly enough. But I also think it's fair to say there were a lot of people who did blame the Bush administration, and maybe not just the diehard people who were already against him. And the logic increasingly went like this. We've got a government that's overseas trying to spread democracy and stop terrorism. We're spending billions of dollars there, and a lot of people feel like, wait a minute, why are we spending all this money on Iraq, all this money in Afghanistan, if we can't take care of our own citizens? It certainly was a line of attack that was partially effective because in 2006, between the war in Iraq going badly and events like Katrina, the popularity of the Republicans really plummeted. If you look at 2006 on this map, you can see that the Democrats took 31 seats in the House and were able to retake the majority. However, what really brought Bush's popularity to its low ebb wasn't just Katrina or Iraq, it was the Great Recession, and that's what you're going to learn about next. First, there's a video that I'm going to have you watch that I didn't produce, but I think does a pretty good job of very quickly summarizing how the Great Recession happened, and then I'm going to talk about the aftermath of it after that. Thanks.